Yeah, so on this we profoundly disagree.
In a hypothetical scenario, let's say you had a lot of money and money wasn't an issue, and you were able to spend some time, going through the therapist's website, pick one out, find somebody with credentials you respect, maybe have some consultations, find somebody you click with. Would you see value in that? Like, what is the value of a therapist to you if you could bypass all of those issues you've mentioned that do seem surmountable potentially if you just did
It's it's a lot like prostitution, right? You're paying someone to pretend to be your friend. You're paying someone to pretend to care, and they don't care. The legitimacy you ascribe to the role of the therapist is probably reciprocal with what you see as the legitimate role of a friend. If your idea of a friend is just someone who will go out and get drunk with you, and I'm not saying this to insult you, but I used to live in Scotland. I've lived in cultures where really the idea of a friend is someone who watches sports with you, someone who drinks alcohol with you. Like, it's just very specific. It's very gender specific also with women. It's different for men. But, if that's your idea of a friend, and then there's this huge gap in your life to talk about anything serious and get meaningful advice, and maybe to have someone tell you that you got to quit drinking, like maybe it is something as simple as that, but still as difficult to do as that, those people will probably be very willing to ascribe legitimacy to the role of a therapist. Yeah, I mean, you've heard my reckless optimism about social media in many ways. It's very easy to talk about. You used this phrase last time, learning the lessons of history, learning from your own mistakes. What video technology gives you is the opportunity to really see your mistakes, really see what you said. And I think most people find that very difficult to do. I think most people, some people would find it difficult to admit to themselves how angry they got about something, or like little things like that. But if you record that conversation, then you watch it afterwards, and you say, "Look, you see, at this point, I was talking about this issue, but in your reply, you were talking about something totally irrelevant." And even if it's little things like that, yeah, I really do believe that's much more useful than our current paradigm of formal, therapy.
But you mentioned that, I'm paraphrasing, but my understanding was that you found talking about sort of personal things in your life to have a more of a positive impact on you than if you were to, say, go to a therapist and talk about your issues there. And you gave a couple anecdotal examples of experiences you had with therapists that didn't go well, where there was different situations and stuff. So I kind of wanted you to elaborate on that, because you brought it up really quickly, but I feel like it's kind of a big topic.
Great topic. Recently I filmed some videos with my girlfriend that we didn't upload. We filmed it just to watch it back ourselves. And, just watching back a conversation like that afterwards, it's like, she means well, but I can say things like, you see, here during this part of the conversation, you're blaming me. And when I point it out to you, you say, oh, yeah, no, I know, I don't mean to blame you. But then 5 minutes later, you're still blaming me. You can just being able to watch back what it is you're saying in the conversation, just being able to do that. A therapist can never do that for you. And even if you have a therapist sitting there, and so like, let's say it's a husband, a wife, and a therapist, and the husband complains, hey, stop it, you're blaming me. And even if the therapist agrees, like, yeah, you were blaming him, the wife would say, oh, yeah, sorry, I didn't mean to. And then later on, she starts blaming the husband again. She won't believe it. The therapist will be, look, that's twice you've gone back to blaming him, even though you said it's not his fault. Like, it's really simple things like that.
Wouldn't the presumed advantage be of there being like we're going to stick with couples therapy. Isn't it kind of like hard to get an objective viewpoint? If a couple is having issues, how are the two of them expected to, if they're not already resolving it, wouldn't kind of the purpose of a therapist be to provide an objective third-party perspective? And although I understand you have a story where this person was not doing great, or the person you were getting therapy with wasn't being totally honest about it, which created problems, but saying that those specific issues weren't there, wouldn't it generally be potentially, do you not see any value in having like a third party come in with a sort of not any sort of bias towards either of you theoretically? And
well, the great news is you can combine the two. I mean, if you've got the money, we could have a therapist come in and sit down in front of the video camera. I could do a YouTube video with therapy. You know, it doesn't have to be mutually exclusive. You can record video and watch the video afterwards. But I think for many people, it's just very difficult to accept. No, you really said that. No, that is really what you meant. Like, it's very easy to make an excuse. Oh, well, yeah, but I didn't mean that. What I meant to say was this. Yeah, but this is what you said, and this is what you meant, and this is how you feel. Look at the video. You can see that's how you feel. That's very powerful and very meaningful. Can you do that, with two people talking to each other plus a therapist? Absolutely. And there are now websites doing it basically via Skype, via video conference, where you have a therapist as a third party present, but you're also sitting there on camera. So these methods can be combined. However, the word you used again and again was objective. I think
objective,
right.
Just out of the two of your subjective points of view to have a third.
But what we're after here is really a kind of intersubjective perspective, right? And the therapist is going to have his or her own subjective perspective that I may not be interested in. I may not respect. One of the therapists I talked to with my ex-wife, who was talking to lawyers today about my divorce. It's still ongoing. The therapist was really impressed with me intellectually. He was like, "Oh, wow. So, how did you decide to study Cambodia? And what kind of philosophy did you study in university?" And they're good questions. I don't mind, but it's completely irrelevant to the problems in the marriage, right? Now, of course, you could have the opposite. I haven't had this kind of therapist. There are plenty of therapists who are traditional Christians, and they look at that in a totally different way. Especially in family counseling, family values. And they're like, well, they come from the church and they grew up playing the guitar in the church basement, and then they got their university degree in counseling or whatever, And they're going to sit there and be like, "What? Why'd you go to Cambodia? What's the matter with you?" Again, that's a subjective perspective. I'm not interested at all. So this is partly in the interest of honesty and partly because it is relevant to this conversation. I tried to pay for one of those online counseling services. So in theory, that's a therapist. And when you sign up, you fill out a form for what kind of person you're looking for. And a lot of things are about whether you're gay or straight, whether you want a therapist who's gay or straight. And they go, fair enough, I don't care. So you kind of go through this form, and then they tell you who they've recommended for you, who's available to be your therapist. And then you either accept or walk away. And I remember the person they recommended just had a degree in social work. They were a social worker. They didn't have another. I was like, So this also, but it brings this other perspective. I have many videos talking about this. It's very easy for people to say to you, "Get professional help." What professional help is there? There may be none, or it may be of such a low quality, or someone with an education that's just irrelevant to your problems. So, if there is no professional help, then we get into the much richer question of what can you do for yourself. And I would absolutely say recording a conversation, again, you don't have to upload it to YouTube. You don't have to upload it anywhere. You can record a conversation on a computer and just sit and watch it afterwards yourselves and really sit there and analyze what's going on and what your problems are. And I think that can be much, much more productive than seeing a therapist.
Well, interesting, because a lot of therapists will recommend journaling, and it's almost like a modern technological version of journaling in a way.
Right, but okay, if you were honest enough to really note this stuff down in your journal, you wouldn't need the therapy to begin with. It's so hard to admit to yourself. Okay, let's talk about Trisha Paytas for 1 second as an example, because it's on video. Every minute of her life is on video. I saw Trisha Paytas get furious at Ethan, age 3, when he said correctly that she was not ready to get pregnant and have a baby because she ate an unhealthy diet. She wasn't capable of having a disciplined diet during the pregnancy. Now, it is an offensive thing to say. In Trisha Paytas' case, it's also completely true. And you could see just how hurt she was by that, just how scorned and furious. And she has a long track record of just completely freaking out when people mention her food or diet or obesity. She's a hair trigger temper for that. Okay. Do you think Trisha Paytas could have, if that were not on videotape, if there were no videotape evidence, do you think she really could go home and write a journal and be like, today somebody said something to me that was completely factually correct, completely well-intentioned, saying that if I want to have a baby, I got to get my head together and eat a disciplined, healthy diet, and I'm not. And I freaked out and I completely lost my temper and went crazy. Of course she can't. Of course she can't write that in her journal. She also can't say that to her therapist. So the level of detachment and self-knowledge and introspection you have to have, I think exactly what you want to address is captured by the video camera and is never captured in a written journal. And it's very unlikely to be presented, honestly, to a therapist or a psychiatrist.
Okay, so initially when I heard you talk about this, my understanding was almost like you had dismissed therapy altogether. So it sounds like that's not the case. So let me ask you this. In a hypothetical scenario where, let's say, for whatever reason you went to that app. Let's say instead of going to the app, let's say you had a lot of money and money wasn't an issue, and you were able to spend some time, going through the therapist's website, pick one out, find somebody with credentials you respect, maybe have some consultations, find somebody you click with. Would you see value in that? Like, what is the value of a therapist to you if you could bypass all of those issues you've mentioned that do seem surmountable potentially if you just did
It's a lot like prostitution, right? You're paying someone to pretend to be your friend. You're paying someone to pretend to care, and they don't care. Keeping it all the way real. I mean,
fair enough if that's your perspective. But I don't know. I'm going to push back on that a little bit because my understanding is that's the idea is your friend shouldn't be doing that for you because let's say I have a problem. Let's say someone died and I need somebody to talk to about it. My friend's not equipped, so I could do that. Maybe they could help me, but maybe they'll say something that makes it even worse. Whereas a therapist, they've been trained. Yes, they're kind of filling in this spot of a person you need. But I feel like to compare them to a friend would suggest that a friend should be playing that role of a therapist normally, which I disagree with.
Okay, so you know me pretty well now. If you were upset and you had a death in your family, you had some kind of unexpected trauma with that, I think you could talk to me. And my friends do. And I think I'm exactly the kind of friend people go to for help that way. And it's basically been the case all my life, and people expect me to be reliable and sober and intelligent and detached and to really tell them something honest and useful. I mean, like a therapist, in theory, your therapist is supposed to be willing to tell you things you don't want to hear. In reality, they don't. In reality, they're flattering because they want you to come back and keep paying this money for this experience. I mean, there are different kinds of bias that creep in with therapists. But I mean, that kind of role you're talking about. Another comparison would be to a grandparent. Can you go to your grandparent and ask this? An idealized, perfect like maybe not the actual grandfather or grandmother you have. It would be nice to imagine you could go to a grandparent and talk about some of these problems and really get advice that's meaningful for you. And I think it's fair to say I've played the role of a grandparent for some of my friends, maybe for all of them, and I'm not uncomfortable with that. So I think you're correct in pointing out there's a kind of reciprocal relationship between these things. Like the legitimacy you ascribe to the role of the therapist is probably reciprocal with what you see as the legitimate role of a friend. If your idea of a friend is just someone who will go out and get drunk with you, and I'm not saying this to insult you, but I used to live in Scotland. I've lived in cultures where really the idea of a friend is someone who watches sports with you, someone who drinks alcohol with you. Like it's very specific. It's very gender specific also with women. It's different for men, but if that's your idea of a friend, and then there's this huge gap in your life to talk about anything serious and get meaningful advice, and maybe to have someone tell you that you got to quit drinking, like maybe it is something as simple as that, but still as difficult to do as that. Those people will probably be very willing to ascribe legitimacy to the role of a therapist. But for me, it's the other way around. I do see that kind of responsibility as something you have to look to your friends for. If you have a great family, maybe your relatives. I don't. I have a terrible dysfunctional family. So no, I look to that. I look to my friends for that, and my friends look to me for that. And I think that's very positive.
So what about okay, this is interesting because I have I'm open to your perspective on this, but I see it very differently. Whereas, for me, both sides of this. So the idea of me presenting my issues to a friend, the reason why I wouldn't do that is maybe maybe there's some magical friend that I've never experienced, but to me, I would see that as a burden. I would see that as something they're not equipped to deal with. I would also potentially, I've tried that before in my past, and it's like because they're not a trained therapist and don't know what to say, they actually say stuff to me that makes me feel more isolated. It's like, oh, you don't understand my problem. Even my friend doesn't get me. Oh, this is just completely backfired.
Right.
And then on the flip side, the scenarios where people have come to me for this type of advice, maybe I've attempted more recent because of a bunch of failed attempts where I realize like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't want the responsibility of giving you advice and finding out that it actually damaged you and stuff. I basically created this sort of like zero tolerance policy on being sort of in this therapist role for a person. And what you were saying was sort of this idea that you can't have deep conversations, but that's what I'm talking about. Like deep conversations, absolutely. Talking about important things in your life with your friends, absolutely. But getting to that point of these are the problems in my childhood that I want to kind of figure out. How is this applying? Like therapist stuff. I feel like you're really walking onto a minefield to engage with that in a non-professional context with someone who you have a relationship with, or even a stranger. Do you not see those things?
Yeah. So on this, we profoundly disagree. Who else would know that? I mean, for me, this is part of the definition of a friend. And then we have another kind of reciprocal question, which is what do you think the professional expertise is that these people have gained that make them capable of doing something helpful or avoiding doing harm by listening to you talk about your childhood trauma? Can talking to a therapist help you? My perspective is that there are a lot of people who have no friends. There are a lot of people like me also who, don't have a grandparent they can turn to for this stuff. So certainly it is quite possible a therapist will be better than nothing, that a therapist will be better than nobody. It's also possible that talking to a prostitute is going to be better than nothing and nobody. And I say that with a human heart. There are people who lead really terrible, isolated lives, and they have nobody to talk to and nobody who cares. And often enough, they end up having some kind of meaningful relationship with a prostitute who knows them well and cares and talks to them about these problems in their life. I'm not stereotyping. I'm not dismissing anything. But no, I don't start from the scientistic assumption, that there is a true treatment, that there is a viable, valid treatment, and that you would be depriving yourself of it by talking to your friends.